country in confronting the seemingly insurmountable challenges. Mr. President, the Secretary General's most recent report has noted that the Aluk water station and power supply were disrupted multiple times in April and May. Thousands of people residing in overcrowded camps and informal settlements are heavily dependent on its supply. The numerous interruptions significantly diminished the capacity to manage the pandemic through basic hygiene precautions and deny an essential service to the most vulnerable. We urge all parties to work together to ensure the sustained flow of water to civilians in need. In northern Syria, Security Council designated terrorist groups continue to pose a considerable threat, and this necessitates coordinated and targeted counterterrorism operations. We, however, remind that these efforts must fully respect obligations under international law. Above all, the well-being of the Syrian people is paramount. Hostilities bring harm to civilians, destroy critical infrastructure, and obstruct the provision of vital humanitarian aid. We strongly urge parties to the conflict to continue to exercise maximum restraint and to de-escalate tensions. The ceasefire in the northwest must be preserved and a nationwide cessation of hostilities must be pursued. Mr. President, Syria's humanitarian situation is inextricably linked to its political process. Without a political solution, which has full regard for Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, the conflict will continue and the humanitarian situation will worsen. Cooperation must be prioritized in order to achieve the goals of Resolution 2254 and to bring peace and stability back to Syria. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Saint-Vincent et les Grenadines pour sa déclaration. Et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Chine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank USG Mr. Lawcock for his briefing and welcome our Syrian and Turkish colleagues to participate in today's meeting. I also listened very carefully to the remarks of Ms. Sirkin. China has growing concern over the economic and humanitarian situation in Syria. We are deeply worried about the suffering of civilians across the country. In the latest report, the Secretary General also shared his deep concern over the accelerating economic decline and its impact on the prices of essentials for the Syrian people. Since June last year, there has been 200% increase in food prices. The Syrian pound reached its lowest point on record against the US dollar. The World Food Program estimated that 9.3 million people are food insecure in Syria. COVID-19 pandemic brings further challenge. The big picture of Syrian humanitarian situation is gloomy. The prominent factor causing economic and humanitarian crisis in Syria is unilateral sanctions. The Secretary General has made distinct appeal for the waiving of sanctions that undermine countries' capacity to respond to the pandemic. The Special Envoy, as well as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, also echoed their global appeal. Regional countries also voiced their concern over sanctions on Syria, holding that such sanctions have already affected the economy of the region. We once again strongly urge relevant countries to lift these sanctions. There have been rich and convincing research and analysis, including those by OCHA, on how sanctions cause humanitarian consequences. For example, sanctions and economic blockade lead to increased unemployment and further result in reduced household income of workers and reduced nutrition intake for workers' dependents. We call on OCHA to pay more attention on the negative impact of sanctions on the humanitarian situation in Syria and other countries, and update the Security Council with comprehensive review in this regard. As we have stated repeatedly, the Syrian government bears the primary responsibility to improve the humanitarian situation in Syria, including preventing and containing the spread of COVID-19. Its role cannot be replaced. We are glad to learn about the progress in cross-line humanitarian operations. In May, WHO dispatched an overland delivery of medical supplies to the northeast from Latakia, apart from deliveries continued by air. UN agencies and the relevant parties should put more focus on removing the obstacles in cross-line operations and work with the Syrian government to use crossing points within its control and with its consent. With regard to cross-border humanitarian assistance, we take note that there are still needs for such operations in Syria, while relevant parties have different positions on the cross-border mechanism. We believe that any decision of the Security Council must show respect for the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Syria. We are willing to maintain communication with fellow council members on this issue. Taking this opportunity, I would also like to express appreciation to the humanitarian workers who are delivering services to the people in need, following the guiding principles of humanitarian emergency assistance as set out in GA Resolution 46/182. Concerning the security situation, China supports the ceasefire appeals made by the SG and his special envoy, and calls on all parties to use this opportunity to enhance political dialogue and mutual trust. Meanwhile, we should keep alerted that armed groups and terrorists are seeking advantage of this period to escalate attacks as accounted in the SG report. Effective, cooperative, and targeted counterterrorism efforts must be put in place. Last but not least, let me reiterate China's firm position of supporting the Syrian-led, Syrian-owned political process, while fully respecting the sovereignty, independence, unity, and the territorial integrity of Syria. Thank you, Mr. President. Merci beaucoup.
Je remercie le représentant de la Chine pour sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante des États-Unis.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Susanna Serkin, for challenging the duties of this council, the moral duties of the council. And thank you, Mark, for your briefing today. I could hear the urgency in your voice, and you know the time is now, and it's the urgency of the moment. So thank you for once again being with us today and being on that emotional roller coaster. And I can give you our word that, as Christoph said, that we promise to do better the next time. We will do better this time. In only 11 days, the Council's mandate for the life-saving cross-border humanitarian aid mechanism will expire. 11 days. I can't overstate how important this Council's decision will be to millions of people throughout Syria. And the decision before the Council is simple. Will we do the right thing and save lives, or will we allow people to die? The answer is clear to the United States, as it should be for every member of this Council. We must authorize the UN's continued use of both Baba Hawa and Baba Salam for 12 months, the mandate of Resolution 2504 for 12 months, and temporarily reopen the Al Yarbiya crossing into the northeast to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Our position is based on fundamental humanitarian imperative and basic human decency. It is based on our obligation to feed the hungry, tend to the sick, do all we can for those who are suffering and in need. Basic needs. This is a responsibility each of us shares as we consider the renewal of Resolution 2504. We, and I mean we, as in each one of us, must make the right choice. We must take action to save lives because al-Assad, his regime, and his allies have failed to meet their basic responsibilities while waging war against the Syrian people. They have turned humanitarian aid into a weapon of this war for almost a decade. As we speak, the regime's despicable starve and siege tactics are heavily restricting the UN's internal cross-line assistance efforts to places like northeast Syria, Rukban, and rural Damascus. These communities rely on cross-line aid approved by Damascus, but they only receive it when politically expedient for Damascus to provide the approvals. This is why only a handful of the cross-line convoys have reached northeast Syria since January, and why the people inside the Rukban IDP camp have had to go for months without UN shipments of food and other supplies, basic needs. Because the Assad regime will not permit the UN to replace cross-border provision of medicines and medical supplies via the cross-line mechanism, al-Yarbiya remains the most viable and effective option for the UN's delivery of such needed supplies and services. Once again, these needed supplies and services are basic. They're basic needs. Its closure undermines the UN's response and the response of all actors that rely on UN imported supplies. Further, the crossing is critical to ensuring the provision of adequate support to the people and the communities recovering from the scourge of ISIS in eastern Syria and in helping prevent ISIS from reemerging in Iraq and Syria. We cannot mistake the one-off deliveries and one-off approvals from Damascus as real progress toward improving and sustained humanitarian access. The UN continues to tell us that cross-line deliveries are insufficient and that large gaps remain between what is needed by millions of Syrians and what Damascus approves. We should trust and we should act on the UN's assessment. This is why the United States is fighting to implement the Secretary General's recommendation to address the needs in northeast Syria through a combination of cross-line and cross-border aid. Restoring cross-border access through al-Yarbiya crossing is essential as we all work with the UN to make cross-line deliveries more regular and impartial, not based on the whims of the murderous regime in Damascus. Troubling, we understand that Russia has terminated its deconfliction arrangement with the UN, putting the lives of millions in northwest Syria at risk, and further obstructing the delivery of UN assistance in this area. Russia's decision is completely unacceptable and is designed to erect new barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance, placing in serious jeopardy the safety and security of humanitarians on the ground. We are shocked that Russia would take such a dangerous step. I want to address head-on the accusations that U.S. sanctions under the Caesar Act are undermining humanitarian access in Syria. Suggestions that our sanctions prevent humanitarian aid from reaching Syria is propaganda meant to distract from the horrors of the Assad regime and its irresponsible economic mismanagement. The Caesar Act and Syria sanctions do not target medicine or food. They focus on significant transactions that support the government of Syria on certain persons acting on behalf of the regime. They target the Assad regime, not the Syrian people. Further, the Caesar Act provides for certain waivers, including a national security interest waiver and a long-term humanitarian waiver. The United States government will continue to work closely with international organizations and the humanitarian assistance community to address any obstacles from our sanctions. We welcome conversations with partners to work through any challenges. As the largest humanitarian donor to Syria, the U.S. has provided $10.6 billion in humanitarian assistance to displaced and conflict-affected Syrians inside and outside of the regime's control and throughout the region. The Caesar Act does not change this, and we will continue our support through our various international and Syrian implementing partners. As we have heard from our briefers, we must never play politics with the lives of the Syrian people. Syria is on the brink of famine. The number of reported COVID-19 cases, while still mercifully low, has already increased to 5 times what they were just 1 month ago. And we know there are not enough testing kits, PPE, and medicine to prevent the disease from spreading in Syria. So I want to ask all of you, how can you look at the situation in Syria and not advocate for a full renewal of the cross-border mechanism for Northwest and Northeast Syria? And as Susanna stated, how can we bargain with the lives and the health of Syrians? It just doesn't make sense. The Council has a moral obligation to the Syrian people to ensure they receive assistance, to ensure that they survive, and to ensure the cross-border mechanism is more vital now than ever in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Trump administration will answer the call to meet this obligation, but we need everyone to answer this call. I urge all of you to stand with us and not to back down in the face of opposition from the Russian Federation as it acts to protect its political and military interest in the region. You know, at the beginning of my remarks, I ask a very simple question. Will we do the right thing to save lives? Or will we allow people to die? I hope the answer to that question is evident to everyone because it really is that simple. I know where we stand, and I hope you'll join me. Let me close with a direct message to the Syrian people. Many of these people I met while I traveled to Bab al-Haba border crossing in March. The United States will not waver in our commitment to you. We will do everything in our power to get you the aid and assistance you need, the basic needs, to survive, thrive, and create a better future for yourselves and your families. I personally will not rest until every child, woman, and man have their needs met. The time is now. We are with you, and we will remain with you. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante des États-Unis pour sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Niger.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mr. President, I would like to begin by thanking Mr. Lowcock and Mrs. Susanna Sirkin for the quality of their briefings. I also thank the Secretary General for his report contained in document S/2020-76, the humanitarian situation in Syria. Unfortunately, that complex situation continues to deteriorate. It is feared that with a health system already weakened by several years of insecurity, COVID-19 disease will spread rapidly, particularly in camps for internally displaced persons where social distancing and hygienic standards can hardly be guaranteed. Mr. President, in that regard, we commend the effort of WHO and all national and international organizations in the prevention and the fight against the spread of COVID-19 in Syria, particularly in conflict-affected areas. Niger also commends the effort of the Syrian government for its continued collaboration with the United Nations and other organizations to enable the delivery of humanitarian assistance within the framework of the cross-border and cross-line mechanism. My delegation calls on the government and the humanitarian organizations to enhance their cooperation and redouble their effort to protect Syrians in all regions of the country. However, Niger remains concerned about reports of an unacceptable humanitarian situation regarding the cases of women and children who are victims of the fighting between armed groups and the fate and well-being of many detainees on both sides. In that regard, we would like to echo the Secretary General appeal to the belligerent to share information on the fate of the detainees with their families within a reasonable time frame. Thus, we also reiterate our support for the appeal launched by Special Envoy Pedersen on 18 May for a massive and unilateral release of the detainees, as well as a clarification of the cases of missing persons. Mr. President, the deterioration of the Syrian economy as a result of a war and the recent devaluation of the Syrian further states the already precarious living conditions of the population. The shortage and the soaring prices of certain basic necessities, including food items, in recent weeks are threatening the livelihood of many Syrian families. According to the World Food Programme, 9.3 million people are now considered food insecure in Syria. Niger reiterates the urgent need to take the necessary steps to guarantee access to food, essential medical supplies, and medical assistance in the context of COVID-19, and echoes the call made by the Secretary General last March for the suspension of the economic sanctions imposed on this country. The Security Council must find a permanent and secure solution to the problem of the delivery of humanitarian aid to the northeast and northwest of Syria. But in the meantime, the cross-border and cross-line mechanism for the delivery of this aid remains the only lifeline for millions of Syrians in need. In that regard, we look forward to the renewal of Resolution 2504 in July on a consensual and non-politicized basis. In conclusion, Mr. President, whether we are talking about humanitarian, political, or chemical weapons issues, respect for Syria's sovereignty and the full involvement of its government in all the processes is crucial in finding lasting solutions to the crisis. My delegation therefore calls on Council members to put aside their differences and make the necessary compromises so that we can help the Syrians turn this painful page in the history of their country. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant du Niger pour sa déclaration.